Hello and good evening, everyone. This is Saeed on WorldStreams Radio, and thank you to our listeners from all over the world for joining us tonight. If you'd like to learn more about WorldStreams Radio, please visit our website at worldstreams.org. Our guest tonight is economist, professor, and writer James Kenneth Galbraith. James Galbraith is currently Lloyd M. Benson's Jr. Chair in Government Business Relations and Professor of Government at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of 6 books and hundreds of scholarly and policy articles. His most recent book, Unbearable Cost, Bush, Greenspan, and the Economics of Empire, was published in late 2006. His next book will be The Predator State, How Conservatives Abandoned the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too. James Galbraith serves as a senior scholar at the Levy Economics Institute and a chair of economists for peace and security. He also writes a column on economic and political issues for Mother Jones and contributes occasionally to the American Prospect, The Nation, the Texas Observer, and to the op-ed pages of the major newspapers. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us, and good evening to you, James. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well,
I should say that the Predator State is available. It's been out since August and has just
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, let me correct that. It's been there since August. And please buy it. I haven't read it, but I will make a point to read it. In light of his recent comments last week, Barack Obama said that Wall Street should not dictate the fate of an entire economy. Was he recognizing that the money policy is the reason for the deep economic crisis that the United States is going through?
I thought it was a landmark statement. It came in the context of some very tough decisions that the administration had to make about how to structure the rescue of the Chrysler Corporation. But it was a step away from the policy that the administration has been conducting toward Wall Street and toward the banks in particular. And if it is the harbinger of a tougher and more realistic line, that would be an extremely good thing. Whether it is or not, though, I don't think we can say for sure at this point.
Right. What does that mean for Wall Street then?
Well, the problem with the policy that the administration has pursued up till now, which has been a fairly much of a continuation of the Treasury policy adopted in the crisis in September under the previous administration, is that it is based upon the idea that the largest banks are indispensable to the financial system and that they should be protected and preserved in their present form, basically no matter what. And in a world in which we are moving away from a bubble economy, in which a major bubble has collapsed, the financial sector is going to shrink in this country. So that if you do that, if you basically protect the largest banks, the shrinkage will come at the expense of a great many smaller banks that are more closely aligned with their communities, were generally better run, and are generally more solvent now. So it's going to be one or the other, and there's every argument against giving the largest banks, which were the fundamental source of the crisis, a complete pass on their past conduct, or a preservation of the position that they had 2 years ago in a financial system that will be radically changed no matter what anybody does.
Well, if we try to make a relationship between the financial, corporate, and also, as you mentioned, the small banks in the little villages and small cities really have been doing well. Do you think that these large corporations really have gone too far from being connected to societies, or is it greed, or is it bad policy?
Well, we need large corporations for very important specific purposes. Without them, you cannot manage large and complex technologies. And you are going to need large banks for the funding needs of large economic entities and for international transactions. But what happened in the last half of the decade was that the large banks were the prime movers behind a process of replacing supervision and oversight of loan quality for a lot of basic retail loans, particularly mortgage loans, but something similar also happened with credit cards and automobile loans. The mortgage loans was the major problem. And rather than having mortgages that were originated by lenders who were paying attention to who the borrowers were and whether they could sustain the loan, we had a massive increase in the share of mortgages that were designed to be originated and then sold and structured in such a way that they would tend to explode in the face of the borrowers after 2 or 3 years. And those loans were then packaged and securitized by the major banks and sold throughout the world's financial system. A lot of money was made on the originations and on the underwriting, on the securitization, and the result was a calamity, a massive disaster as these loans, as the mortgages reset and the securities, the mortgages defaulted and the securities lost value, and eventually the last few months of 2008, there was a massive panic as everybody realized that the entire banking system was in enormous trouble. It was fundamentally the largest banks and the investment banks that were responsible for that. The question then is, do you take those assets off their books and say, go back to the game, guys, everything is clear, or do you have a more fundamental reform of the system?
Well, let's look for a second here at deregulation. Did deregulation have any provisions for something like this? I mean, regulation before deregulation, which really pans the conservative view versus the conservative view of capitalism, laissez-faire, and so forth, versus the interventionist policy to make sure that all the transactions that are taking place have some kind of security buffer, risk, less risk-taking buffer, and so forth.
Well, the regulation is intended to protect us all against fraudulent practices, and fraudulent practices were pervasive here. Mortgages were being issued and given to people who couldn't document their incomes, who couldn't support a credit history, whose houses were flagrantly overappraised by appraisers who were being hired in order to inflate the values and who wouldn't have gotten the business otherwise. There was pervasive fraud in the origination, and when these loans were bundled together and sold as securities, those securities were passed to a rating agency to look at them, and the rating agencies pronounced certain parts of them to be AAA without ever examining the underlying loan documents. So that also was a fraud in the sense that the rating agencies have an obligation to know something about the loan quality of the assets that they are basically putting their stamp of approval on. And they didn't. They simply made up a mathematical model which told them that it was, in their view, likely that the senior tranches would not default. Well, it turned out that the mathematical models were wrong, and the rating agencies have an enormous amount of responsibility for that. All of that was or should have been subjected to very severe regulatory scrutiny, which would have prevented the originations and the underwriting. And the regulatory scrutiny was deliberately removed in the last half of the decade that we've just come through. It was deliberately removed because the Bush administration believed that it was in their interest and would stimulate the economy in the short run to have a bigger housing boom, and they were happy to have their friends making the money off of the origination fees and off of the underwriting. So this was, in some sense, a conspiracy in which government agencies and private sector entities